My name is Gabriel Carlon. I'm the reviews editor at Peace News. And it's my pleasure this evening, along with Emily Johns, who's one of Peace News' co-editors, to welcome you here to this event with Adam. I'd like to start. I've got it all written on a bit of paper, so I don't forget it. I'd like to start by thanking Quaker Peace and Social Witness for donating us the room here this evening, and to thank the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust for making the whole year-long project, of which this event is also the launch, possible. So I'd like to put those in first. Adam's book, To End All Wars, was the primary inspiration for this project, The World Is My Country. And it was back in 2011 when I first read the book. And I was scribbling notes in the back of it on a train as I was coming back to Hastings. And I got to page 191, which is about the No Conscription Fellowship, and about this mischievous appropriation of Archibald Bodkin's words. He was the prosecutor in the case taken against the NCF. And I scribbled in the back, idea, get M to do a Celebrate People's History poster or posters around World War I anti-war movement. And tonight's event and the project is the very much belated outcome of that thought, inspired by Adam's book. So I'm going to ask Emily just to say a little bit about the project.
Yes. So Gabriel did say, "What about this?" And I was like, "Yes." He had. Gabriel always gives me lots of books, and I dutifully read them. And each one of them, that was a really good book. And I think some years ago he gave me Adam Hochschild's book about the ending of the ending of the British slave trade, and I read it and was quite inspired by the fact that the book covered the ordinary people and the details of the work and the details of the campaigning and the strategies and how you build up a huge campaign that has such enormous worldwide significance. And then he said, "You must read this First World War book," and which again has this trajectory of following the campaigning and the strategy and the nitty-gritty of what it was like to be a anti-war campaigner before and during the First World War. And we thought, okay, there is, the commemoration of the First World War is going to be vast, and it is already starting, and it's this whole machine. But that the important thing is also to counter the way that machine is going to be used as a general sort of upping of militarisation in Britain, and a sort of all these stories are used to shift politics or to shift culture, and we thought it was enormously important to take the stories about the anti-war movements, not just the conscientious objectors, but the people that weren't sent to the front but were supporting the conscientious objectors, the people that were running sort of the underground railways to get conscientious objectors into safety, the people who were publishing newspapers, who were going to prison, who were women who were taking over roles, just as sort of with the military machine, women found themselves on the road. But you get a parallel in the anti-war movement as pub editors were being imprisoned and women becoming editors, and lots of interesting stories about resistance to the First World War in sort of global South, and we decided that yes, to start off, being a picture maker myself, I was like, okay, yes, images. Let's take images, and then it sort of rolled into, well, what about the fact that there are so many songs of the First World War? Let's commission songs. Let's have our own, and let's commission poetry, and let's be part of the movement to shift how history is used. And so this was the beginning of it. And as Gabriel said, why don't you do a picture? And so this was the first one, which was only finished day before yesterday. I was like, oh no, I've got to finish it. So it was sort of a way of taking the stories that belong to all of us and raising them up and projecting them out there into the world. So we have got a sort of a great over the next year. We thought we should do a tour of the country, we should do lots of talks, we should try to get images and poetry in billboard size. And so part of that has been raising funds, applying for grants, that the anti-war movement should have as big a profile as the pro-war movement. And I thought, there's lots and lots, I'd advise you to read Adam's book because there's lots of delightful stuff, but I think also the thing was to make a structure where all the stories that once people begin to dig in their own communities, that you find that there are so many stories about, and images, and about what people were doing against the war in the First World War. And I thought, I just stuck this on the front of the last piece of news, which was a lovely picture of a American woman she's marching down the middle of a road in a very sort of suburban American setting in very fancy white boots, white clothes, with this big sign saying peace and waving a flag. And I think that was a sort of thing to remember, that there was a lot of joy and mischief and imagination that went into the campaigning, as alongside the awful suffering that was happening to both conscientious objectors and anti-war activists who were imprisoned. So it's very exciting to have Adam here to talk with us.
It's been my great pleasure to introduce very briefly Adam Horschild. As many of you will know, he's the author of a string of wonderful books, including King Leopold's Ghost, The Unquiet. I thought for a moment maybe it's not called The Unquiet Ghost because it's got ghost in the title, but it is called The Unquiet Ghost. That's the amazing one about Stalinist Russia. If you haven't read that one, I urge you to seek that one out. And the book that he's going to talk to us about this evening, To End All Wars. He has won numerous awards for his writing, but perhaps even better than that, he is part of Rebecca Solnit's Secret Political Library of Hope, and I think that's a very well-deserved award. Adam Horschild.
Well, thank you, Gabriel, and thank you, Emily. It's a delight for me to be here at Friend's house. It's a particular delight because I did some of the research for my book about the British anti-slavery movement in the library, right on this floor. So I did a lot of my research for this book on the British anti-slavery movement in the library here. And in fact, I remember it very fondly because one of the greatest one of the great joys of writing history is you work in archives and you look at letters and diaries and so forth from people who lived in times past, but who cared about the same things that we do today. And one of the great things they have in the library here is a pocket diary, leather-bound pocket diary from the year 1792, kept by a traveling organizer for the anti-slavery movement. It's very sweet to sort of look back 200 years in time and see people with the same, caring about the same things we do today. And so many of these problems are still with us. Anyway, I think of this building as a place where I was able to have that pleasure of connection with the past. Speaking of connection with the past, something that was very moving to me tonight was to hear the choir, because it reminded me that one of the things that happened in Britain during the First World War was that there were peace choirs who went out on the streets outside the prisons where conscientious objectors were imprisoned. And they sang. And if you look back at the old issues of the newspaper of the No Conscription Fellowship, you can find letters from people in the prison talking about how much it meant to them to hear these voices singing on the street outside. So let's talk about the First World War. And I know that all of you care, as I do, about remembering it in a different way than governments are telling us to remember it these days. As long as I can remember, I have been fascinated and horrified by the First World War. I think there are good reasons for focusing and feeling a sort of horrified fascination with this period of history. The war left behind it some 20 million dead, military and civilian, which was 6 times the number of people killed in any previous war on the continent of Europe. It left behind an even larger number of wounded. And of course, it left large parts of Europe in ruins in a way that previous wars never had. Because as the armies of the great powers retreated, they left scorched earth behind them, poisoned the wells, blew up buildings, destroyed everything that could be of possible any use to the other side. And you had scenes like this across a swath of northern France and Belgium, and on an even wider stretch of territory on the Eastern Front. Now, I have to confess I also have a personal reason for being fascinated with the First World War, which is that an uncle of mine fought in it. He was in the Imperial Russian Air Force. That's him with his fighter squadron. And if you look closely at the picture, you will see hanging around his neck a little medal that has a little cross on it. That's the cross of the Order of St. George, which was the highest medal awarded by Tsarist Russia, which entitled the bearer to a personal audience with the Tsar at any time of day or night. A privilege that was not much use after 1917. Now, there's another reason I've always been drawn to this period, which is that it saw the end of a kind of imperial grandeur that really set the tone in Europe, especially at that time. This is Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany on the left and his 6 sons marching in a parade. And just look at those hats. Here is, here's the Kaiser's wife and his daughter. You can't say that people have never worn hats like this ever since then, because we did see things like this at the recent royal wedding here, but somehow there's something about these hats that express a certain imperial self-confidence of a world that's really gone forever. When we remember the First World War, I think it's important to remember the illusions that made the war possible, made it likely to happen, speeded up its start, because they are still, some of these are still illusions that people have today. One important illusion, I think, was the illusion that victory would be quick and easy. These are students in Berlin marching off to enlist in August 1914. Here they are in uniform, getting into a railway car, and on the side it says, "To Paris." French troops marching off with equal enthusiasm, also getting into railway cars, and on the side it says, "To Berlin." So this illusion of quick and easy victory, I think, is something that allows so many wars to start so easily, and it's still very much with us today when we think of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which have been going on for quite a while now. A second illusion that I think of as characteristic to some extent of wars in general, and certainly of the First World War, is the illusion that you might be shooting at the enemy, but they would not be shooting at you. How else can you explain the uniforms that several million French infantrymen wore when they marched off to battle in 1914? These bright red caps, it just made it easier for the sharpshooters on the other side. Millions of French soldiers, this was their standard uniform. Same thing on the other side. Austro-Hungarian cavalry also liked their red and blue, and they did not abandon those bright colors until 1916. A third illusion, characteristic of the First World War, and I think there are parallel things you can point to in later wars, but particularly in 1914, was the illusion that the cavalry itself could play a role in modern industrialized warfare. These are French cavalrymen here, Indian cavalry brought all the way from India to the Western Front by the British. The Germans had their famous Ulan Lancers. There were 40,000 Germans on horseback, cavalrymen, who were in the force that invaded France and Belgium in 1914. And everyone practiced for the great cavalry charges that were the stuff of legend. This is a British cavalryman here practicing running his sword through a dummy. People anticipated cavalry battles almost as if it was sport, almost like, knights in armor jousting in a tournament. And indeed, you can find throughout so much of the literature of the war the metaphor of sports. The first correspondent that the Daily Mail in London sent to the front in 1914 was the newspaper's sports editor. Of course, this illusion, like all of the others, ran up against reality. Cavalry could do nothing in the age of barbed wire, not to mention the machine gun. And the result, as you know very well, is that the war on the Western Front bogged down in trenches. The line of battle moved very, very little for 3 of the 4.5 years of the war. For example, take the year 1915, when there were probably more than 1 million soldiers killed and wounded on both sides on the Western Front alone. The Allies launched several enormous attacks. Things that left hundreds of thousands of people dead and wounded. In the entire year, the Allied armies gained 8 square miles of ground. And of course, instead of those great cavalry charges, people found themselves fighting in devastated landscapes. On the Western Front in France and Belgium, more than 700 million artillery shells were fired over the 4.5 years of the war. And this is what it looked like after that time. This used to be a forest. People found themselves living below ground in trenches. They found themselves sharing space with rats. These are German soldiers here. They found themselves fighting knee-deep in mud. And they found themselves facing terrifying new weapons, like the flamethrower, or like poison gas, against which they improvised defenses. These are some of the first gas masks, but they didn't always work. And if you weren't killed by gas, you could be blinded, like these British soldiers in this picture. And the vast majority of soldiers who were wounded, though, were wounded by bullets and shrapnel, and all you have to do is to look at one picture and then, in your mind, multiply it by 21 million, which is the number of soldiers who were wounded in this war. The war, of course, had effects that rippled far beyond the casualties. I think it gave us a darker vision of human nature in the world. Cartoons like this began appearing during the war. And I think in many ways the period of Victorian optimism in the 19th century was gone forever after 1914. Now, something else that is unusual about the First World War is this. When we think about wars in recent years, and I think this is perhaps especially true for the various wars that the United States has launched, it's usually the poor who do the dying. The First World War was different. These are officer cadets at Eton in 1915. And in all of the major armies, British, French, German, Russian, The casualties among the officers, which meant casualties among people coming from the aristocracy and the upper classes, were always proportionately higher than those among the enlisted men. Very unusual. You usually do not see the ruling classes of countries being personally self-destructive in this way. Think about these Eton cadets in 1915. In 1916, there were more than 30 Etonians killed in a single day, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Men who went down from Oxford in the year 1913, 31% were killed. Just to zero in on England for a second, Hatfield House, one of the great English country houses, long the seat of the Cecil family. The patriarch of that family, Lord Salisbury, Prime Minister of Britain for many years at the turn of the century, he had 10 grandsons. 5 of them were killed in the war. Here's one of them, George Cecil, died at the age of 18 in 1914. Prime Minister Asquith of Britain lost a son in the war. So did his counterpart, the German Chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg. The man in the middle in this picture, General Sir Herbert Lawrence, who was Chief of Staff of the British Army on the Western Front, lost 2 sons. His counterpart in the French Army, General Noël de Castelnau, lost 3 sons. So I think part of what we have to think about and try to figure out when we look at the war is how could men like that, the generals, the cabinet ministers, the prime ministers, literally order their own sons into these deadly battles that were sooner or later bound to be fatal, day after day, week after week, month after month, for 4.5 years. Now, the very madness of the people who orchestrated the war on both sides has always made me admire another type of person, the resistors. And there were resistors in all of the major countries. In the United States, the great labor leader Eugene V. Debs spoke out very strongly against the war when the United States entered it in 1917. For that, he was sent to prison by the administration of President Woodrow Wilson, and he was still in prison in 1920 when he received 1 million votes for president on the socialist ticket. In Germany, Rosa Luxemburg, the great revolutionary, staunch opponent of the war, also sent to prison. In France, the most outspoken opponent of the war on its eve was Jean Jaurès, the socialist leader. A week before the war began, there was an emergency conference of the leaders of all Europe's left-wing parties in Brussels. Jaurès went to Brussels, and before an enormous crowd there, he put his arm around the shoulders of the German socialist leader and said, "We will never make war on each other." Went back to Paris. 3 days later, he was assassinated. 3 days after that, the war began. This country's greatest philosopher, Bertrand Russell, someone I came to admire more than ever in working on this book, was a staunch opponent of the war, spent 6 months in prison because of it. I think one of the things that I admire most about Russell was not just his clarity about the importance of not participating and of resisting this war, but the way he was very open later in talking about how torn he was in his heart. Let me read you something he wrote. He described himself after the war as having been during wartime tortured by patriotism. "I desired the defeat of Germany as ardently as any retired colonel. Love of England is very nearly the strongest emotion I possess, and in appearing to set it aside at such a moment, I was making a very difficult renunciation. But as a lover of truth, the national propaganda of all the belligerent nations sickened me, As a lover of civilization, the return to barbarism appalled me. As a man of thwarted parental feeling, the massacre of the young wrung my heart. 6 months in prison. Somebody else who spent 6 months in prison was this country's greatest investigative journalist, Edmund Dean Morell. If any of you have read my book, King Leopold's Ghost, you'll remember him as the person who put the great human rights scandal of the atrocities in the Congo on the world's front pages. Morell was made to serve his sentence at hard labor. It broke his health, and he died still in his 50s, 6 years after the war. Now, the war that men and women like this opposed was accompanied by a relentless barrage of propaganda on all sides. It was the first big propaganda war. This is a U.S. Army recruiting poster characterizing the Germans. Here is a German poster, with God for king and fatherland, and of course God was invoked by both sides. Here's a poster from Australia, trying to get people alarmed about a possible German invasion of Australia, if you can imagine that. Some of the propaganda had a real edge to it. If you didn't want to fight, you were cowardly. You were guilty of letting your country down. And worst of all, you were effeminate. So all of the countries, barraged their citizens with propaganda in a very intense and carefully thought out way, because they had to keep people roused up to fight this war. Now, as I said, there were war resistors in all of the major belligerents, but there were more of them in Britain than anywhere else. And I think it's a heritage that you can be very proud of. Over the course of the war, there were more than 20,000 young men of military age who refused to allow themselves to be conscripted into the British Army. Some of them accepted the status as a conscientious objector, which meant that you had to work in a war industry or do something like driving an ambulance at the front. But many of them, as a matter of principle, refused that. And more than 6,000 young men here were sent to prison, to places like this. This is at Wandsworth, and that sort of metal netting that you can see stretched across there is to prevent people from committing suicide by jumping off the balcony. This was, up to this point in time, the largest number of people who had ever been in prison in a Western democracy for political reasons. Now, I'm deeply interested in the story of these dissenters, and I think they're people that we need to honor. I think also in looking at this period, we need to recognize that one thing that made it hard for some of them is that often the division of political opinion happened not just among citizens of this country, but it happened within a family. And I got fascinated by this. I was trying to figure out a way to tell this story that wouldn't be just a series of portraits of the generals and then a series of portraits of the dissenters. And for a long time, I couldn't figure out how to do it. And then one day I was reading a very boringly written scholarly article about the great pacifist and socialist Charlotte Despard, whom you may remember was a very outspoken radical at the turn of the century. She backed independence for India, independence for Ireland. She went to jail 4 times in the battle for women's suffrage. She supported every left-wing cause of the day. And I've not known much about her, but in reading this article about her, the writer, one sentence in passing, said Mrs. Despard's views were, of course, deeply upsetting to her brother. And it gave his name, Sir John French, Commander-in-Chief on the Western Front. So I thought, that's going to be an interesting relationship to write about. And indeed it was. The remarkable thing is that this brother and sister were very fond of each other. They remained friends, continued to see each other throughout the war. They stopped speaking to each other only in 1918, when French was sent to Ireland by the British government. You know, the Nationalist Rebellion had started up again there, and they felt a military man with a strong hand was called for as viceroy. They sent him to Ireland as viceroy. She went to Ireland to work for the IRA, and they stopped talking. There were other divided families as well. Perhaps the most famous was the Pankhursts. You remember, I'm sure, Emmeline Pankhurst, the matriarch of the family that it was in many ways at the heart of the movement for women's suffrage here. She went to jail many times. She's being escorted off to jail in this picture. And on the eve of the war, 1913, she was arrested and jailed for literally throwing a rock through the window of 10 Downing Street. The moment the war began, she ceased all of her suffrage activities, brought the organization to a stop, put herself at the service of the British government, and traveled throughout the British Isles to the United States, to Canada, trying to whip up enthusiasm for the war. Meanwhile, her daughter Sylvia became one of Britain's most outspoken opponents of the war, published the most widely read anti-war newspaper, and she and her mother stopped speaking to each other and essentially never resumed. Here's another divided British family or family group. One of the figures in it is Emily Hobhouse, whom you probably know. Her name is most associated with the work that she did during the Boer War, exposing the network of concentration camps for Boer civilians that Britain ran. However, during the First World War, she did something quite remarkable. In 1916, she traveled from Britain to France, France to Switzerland, Switzerland to Germany. Switzerland was neutral, of course. Switzerland to Germany, went to Berlin, went to call on the German foreign minister, whom she had known before the war, and began talking about possible peace terms. And she thought she got enough of a response from him to be the groundwork for something that might be a possible deal. Went back to Switzerland, to France, to England, came here, tried to see various people high in the British government, and she was immediately dismissed as a total crackpot, and nothing came of this. However, in this war that killed 20 million people, she was the only person who traveled from one side to the other and back again in search of peace. And I think she needs to be remembered and honored for that. She had a great influence on a cousin of hers, Stephen Hobhouse, who, he's much older in this picture, but at the time of the war he was of military age. He was very much influenced by the ideas of his cousin Emily. He was a Quaker. He became a resistor. He was sent to prison, and not only sent to prison, but he was put in solitary confinement, because in British prisons at that time, they had the so-called rule of silence, where you were not allowed to talk to other prisoners. He said, I'm going to talk to my fellow human beings when I want to, and they locked him up in solitary for the rest of the war. One of the things that made this family group intriguing to me was that the person who had acted as godfather at Stephen Hobhouse's birth, Alfred Lord Milner, was at the time Minister of War. So another family that was divided. There are, of course, many more people who were on both sides of the debate in the UK. One of the most famous pro-war voices, of course, was Rudyard Kipling, who was a tremendous enthusiast for every war that Britain ever fought or conceivably could fight. He encouraged a love of all things military in his son John, who's probably 4 years old in this picture. And John Kipling early on decided on a military career, had great trouble getting into the military because he'd inherited his father's bad eyesight. You know how Kipling wears those very thick glasses in every picture you see. The elder Kipling pulled strings, finally got John a commission as a lieutenant. John Kipling went into action at the Battle of Loos in 1915 and was never seen again. Some people from the other side. One of the leading war resistors was Fenner Brockway, who had been editor of the Labor Leader. Another war resistor was Alice Wheeldon, on the right here, with two of her daughters in the middle, and there's a prison warden on the left. She came from Derby. There are some people here from Derby tonight who are Keith and others who are trying to honor her memory there. She was sent to prison with members of her family on a totally trumped up charge of allegedly trying to poison the prime minister. It was complete nonsense. But they were really after her because the family were longtime radicals who had been sheltering men on the run from conscription in their house. They wanted to send a message to the anti-war movement. And the activists in Derby today have succeeded in getting a blue plaque on what used to be her house. She was a dealer in secondhand clothes, not a wealthy woman at all. And they are working on trying to get her conviction retroactively overturned. Another great war resistor, Keir Hardie, leader of the Independent Labour Party, somebody who was really the major figure on the British left in 1914 at the outbreak of war, and somebody who, like so many people on the left at that time, hoped that the working classes of Europe would not go to war against each other. And when that nonetheless happened, I think it really broke his heart, and he died early the next year, April of 1915, still in his 50s. One of my favorite anti-war campaigners in Britain is a man named John S. Clarke. Came from a circus family in Scotland. He went into the ring as a lion tamer at the age of 17, and he was then the youngest lion tamer in Great Britain. Then he got involved in radical politics, was strongly opposed to the war, went underground in 1914, continued to write against the war, was one of the editors of an anti-war newspaper that the authorities were always trying to find to shut down. They never succeeded in finding it. He surfaced after the war, was briefly a Labour Party member of Parliament, then spent the last 10 years or so of his life on the Glasgow City Council. And whenever a circus came to town, he went back into the ring as a lion tamer and was then the oldest lion tamer in Great Britain. The war that people like this resisted caused absolutely unprecedented suffering. There were so many soldiers killed that by the end, the British were drafting 17-year-olds, and the Germans were taking boys who were still younger. And still, the carnage went on and on and on. And by the time it was over, it left more than 9 million military dead and probably around 10 to 12 million civilian dead. We will never know those figures with any precision. And not only that, of course, but it led to enormous upheavals in 20th century politics, many of them instigated by the man on the right in this picture shown with his First World War German army unit, who 20 years later led the world into an even more destructive war and the Holocaust to boot. So my hope is that when we think back on this war, we'll remember not just the politicians and not just the generals, but the people who tried even though they didn't succeed, who tried to stop the bloodshed. Now, I'm going to end, providing our sound system cooperates here, with playing you some music. It's a song some of you may know, The Green Fields of France, by the songwriter Eric Bogle, originally from Scotland, sung here by John McDermott. And Bogle says that he was inspired to write this song when he visited one of those vast, vast military graveyards spread throughout northern France and Belgium. Saw the name of an Irish soldier, McBride, on a tombstone, and the song is addressed to Willie McBride. While it's playing, I am going to show some documentary film footage from the First World War, but I would urge you, listen to the words of the song. It should come on.
Well, how do you do, young Willie McBride? Do you mind if I sit here down by your graveside and rest for a while neath the warm summer sun? I've been walking all day and I'm nearly done. I see by your gravestone you were only 19 when you joined the Great Fallen in 1916. I hope you died well, and I hope you died clean. Or young Willie McBride, was it slow and unseen? Did they beat the drum slowly? Did they play the fife lowly? Did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? Did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest? Did you leave a wife or a sweetheart behind? In some faithful heart is your memory enshrined. Although you died back in 1916, in that faithful heart are you forever 19? Or are you a stranger without even a name, enclosed then forever behind a glass frame? In an old photograph, torn, battered and stained, and faded to yellow in a brown leather frame. Did they beat the drum slowly? Did they play the fife lowly? Did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? Did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest? Sun, now it shines on the green fields of France. There's a warm summer breeze makes the red poppies dance. And look how the sun shines from under the clouds. There's no gas, no barbed wire, there's no gun firing now. But here in this graveyard, it's still no man's land. The countless white crosses stand mute in the sand. To man's blind indifference to his fellow man, to a whole generation that were butchered and damned. Did they beat the drum slowly? Did they play the fife lowly? Did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? Did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest? I am Willie McBride, I can't help wonder why. Do those that lie here know why did they die? And did they believe when they answered the call? Did they really believe that this war would end war? For the sorrow, the suffering, the glory, the pain, killing and dying was all done in vain. For young Willie McBride, it all happened again, and again and again and again and again. Did they beat the drum slowly? Did they play the fife lowly? Did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? Did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest? Did they beat the drum slowly? Did they play the fife lowly? Did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? Did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest?